Hold on for a second. Imagine you wake up one morning and the news says, a landing has begun in the United States, or the U.S. for short. But here's the wildest part. In this scenario, the U.S. military is gone. Yes, completely gone. No Navy, no Air Force, no Marines. Now let's ask the question more clearly. Even then, is it possible to conquer the U.S. within a month? People sometimes think, if there's no army, it's over. No, that's when the real movie starts. In this video, I'm going to show you, step by step, in a way anyone can understand, why the U.S., even if we pretend it has no military, turns into a logistical meat grinder for any invader. What do I mean by logistics? Food, water, fuel, ammunition, spare parts, medicine, hospitals, communications. In other words, the life you have to carry to keep a war running, and that life starts breaking apart before you even get close. So buckle up. First, we'll look at the oceans. Then we'll see why Canada and Mexico are not easy routes. Then we'll talk about how mountains become natural fortresses. Then why people turn it into a nightmare. And finally, why money and governing make it a win and still lose situation. And at the very end, I'll leave you with a question. Which region do you think would be the biggest headache? 1. Liquid walls, meaning the oceans. The U.S. has the Atlantic Ocean to the east and the Pacific Ocean to the west. Just because it looks blue on a map doesn't mean it's easy. For an invader, these are supply lines thousands of kilometers long. And the longer the supply line, the more the risk multiplies. Because everything has a fuel cost. Tanks, trucks, ships, helicopters, even the soldiers themselves. A soldier burns calories, needs water, gets sick, needs treatment. Now think about this. You're moving hundreds of thousands of people, plus their food, fuel, ammunition, spare parts, medical gear, field hospitals, tents, generators, satellite links, cables. Everything from the other side of an ocean. This is not just send some ships. It's a supply chain that has to flow day and night like a factory. If it breaks even for a single day, a tank sitting there becomes nothing but metal. Even working vehicles stop, and anything that stops becomes a target. And there's the nearby base problem. In many wars, the attacker builds up in a neighboring country, sets up depots, stacks reserves, uses ports and airports. Near the U.S., finding a massive staging area like that is hard because 2 giant oceans sit in the way. Coming from across an ocean adds a distance tax to everything. More fuel, more time, more breakdowns, more delays. And there's one more thing. Hiding a logistical movement this big is incredibly difficult. We're talking about hundreds of ships, thousands of containers, tens of thousands of vehicles. It's like a glowing city at night. In other words, long before you reach the shore, everyone can tell something is happening. You might say, but the U.S. military is gone. Fine. What about ports, cranes, fuel depots, bridges, rail networks, roads, communications lines, and the power grid? They're still there, and they're all so fragile. To take a country, it's not enough to step onto the coast. You also have to keep the country's internal transport arteries working. And here's the irony. The number of suitable places where you can unload heavy equipment and dock large ships is limited. When suitable points are limited, the invader is forced to concentrate around a few critical spots. When you concentrate, everything slows down. When it slows down, your supply line stretches. When it stretches, it starts snapping. And the coastline job doesn't end with get off the ship. You need cranes to unload containers, lines to pump fuel, forklifts to move cargo, and then trucks to carry it inland. If one link in that chain slows down, a pileup starts on the coast, and the moment that pileup starts, the invaders' time, money, and morale begin to bleed. 2. I'll come in through a neighbor, Canada or Mexico. Sounds easy, right? On a map, it looks like there's a door. Enter here, exit there. But geography doesn't work like that. If you want to come down through Canada, know this first. A huge part of Canada is the Canadian Shield, a region of extremely hard rock, lakes, and forests. It's not a flat highway where mechanized forces, meaning armored units that move fast with vehicles, can cruise forward. Because the population is low, the infrastructure is sparse. And when infrastructure is sparse, it becomes even harder for a large force to move fast and cleanly. Because an army doesn't just march, it hauls. Let me put it simply. For an army, roads are like supermarkets. No roads, no food deliveries, no gas stations, no fuel, no repair shops, no working vehicles. That supermarket is infrastructure. Coming through Canada means long distances, thin infrastructure, harsh climate, unpredictable weather, and huge empty spaces. Those empty spaces don't speed you up, they slow you down, because you have to bring everything from behind. So Mexico then, you say. What about the border region around Mexico? Desert zones, high heat, water scarcity, long distances, and natural obstacles in many places. Even if you cross the border, reaching major population and industrial centers inside the U.S. doesn't happen right away. What looks short on a map can turn into days and weeks in real conditions. The border itself is long, but not every stretch is an easy crossing. Rivers, rough terrain, open wilderness, scattered settlements. All of that creates a different problem at every step for an invader. The simple truth is this: the longer the route you advance on, the longer the supply line behind you becomes. And the longer that supply line gets, the more vulnerable points you create. That's the math of war. 3. Natural death zones, meaning mountains and passes. Let's say a miracle happens and you land on the coast or push in through a neighbor. Now the goal is to move inland. In the U.S., two big realities show up: massive mountain belts and enormous interior distances. If you push in from the west, you run into the Rocky Mountains, a vast and high mountain system. If you push in from the east, you deal with the Appalachians, a long, forested, rugged belt. This isn't, there are mountains, we'll cross. The point is this: heavy vehicles are fast on flat land, but they slow down in narrow passes, tunnels, bridges, sharp turns, steep grades, and winter conditions. When you slow down, convoys stretch out. When convoys stretch out, control becomes harder. When control becomes harder, even a small disruption becomes a major traffic jam. And when you jam, you lose time. When you lose time, you burn more fuel. When you burn more fuel, you need more maintenance. And everything snowballs. Rough terrain also shortens visibility. Short visibility increases ambushes. More ambushes crush morale. Low morale weakens discipline. Weak discipline increases accidents. More accidents slow you again. Geography isn't just an obstacle. It's a chain reaction machine. Remember this: for an invader, time is priceless, because the longer it takes, the more fuel, food, parts, and people you burn. But for the defenders, time is a force multiplier, because they're fighting at home and can organize more and adapt more each day. 4. A rifle behind every blade of grass, meaning an armed civilian population and scattered resistance. Now we get to the most human, but also the harshest part of the equation. The U.S. is an extreme case in civilian gun ownership. Various studies say civilians hold hundreds of millions of firearms. Broadly speaking, estimates often mention a number above 400 million, which is an insane density relative to the population. The key point is this: having guns doesn't automatically win a war, but it explodes the cost of an occupation, because occupation isn't go in and plant a flag. Occupation is hold and govern. To control a city, it's not enough to take one main building. You also have to manage roads, depots, fuel points, communications, water, electricity, hospitals, and food. Now imagine this. In every town, every neighborhood, every home, there are people whose identities you don't know, but who know the terrain. Add to that millions of veterans with military experience. By veterans, I mean people who have seen war, understand discipline, organization, communications, first aid, and planning. This is the nightmare scenario for any occupier. Not a single centralized structure with one leader, but thousands of small nodes. Catch one leader, and it doesn't end. Take one city, and it doesn't end. Resistance becomes local, and when it's local, every place behaves like a small fortress. One group blocks a road, another hides information, another strikes, another sabotages, another misdirects, another refuses to move supplies, another slows down normal life. And it's not only armed individuals. Local administrations and civilians can do it too. The city doesn't operate. Contractors don't show up. Operators quit. Systems lock up. Let me be very clear. This isn't guerrilla war romanticism. This is the governing cost of occupation. The occupier has to assign soldiers to every small incident. And the more soldiers you assign to scattered incidents, the thinner your force spreads. When it spreads thin, it breaks. There's a classic calculation. To control a large hostile population, you need a certain number of security personnel per 1,000 people. The exact number varies, but when it scales into the millions, the problem becomes simple. You don't have enough humans. And in a country as large as the U.S., with big cities and wide rural spaces separated by long distances, that problem becomes even sharper. 5. The internal logistical black hole, meaning infrastructure and distance. Here's one more thing. The U.S. has roads, rail, ports, bridges, and warehouses, commercial arteries that look like an advantage. But for an invader, those arteries also become a dependency, because you can't instantly transplant your own logistics system into the middle of a continent. You want to use what already exists. But existing infrastructure is fragile in wartime. Power cuts, signal disruptions, broken lines, halted fuel deliveries, closed bridges, rail failures, jammed interchanges. Each one looks small, but together they create one result. Supplies arrive late. When supplies are late, ammo runs out, fuel runs out, food runs out. When fuel runs out, tanks don't move. When food runs out, soldiers can't fight. When medicine runs out, the wounded die. When spare parts run out, vehicles break down on the road. And the most important point is this. The farther inland you go from the coast, the more distance you have to carry supplies across. The deeper you go, the more you remain tied to the ocean. The ocean becomes a wall behind you, thousands of kilometers of water at your back, thousands of kilometers of land ahead. That's a psychological trap, too. And the interior of the U.S. isn't just city to city. There are huge gaps, vast agricultural zones, long highways, scattered settlements. That means convoys move along very long corridors. Longer corridors mean more risk points. And the longer the corridor, the more a single breakdown creates a domino effect. One truck stops, the line piles up behind it, fuel waits, time bleeds, momentum collapses. And there are rivers, too. Massive river systems like the Mississippi draw natural lines across the country. You become dependent on specific crossing points. Rail has a similar dependency. U.S. freight rail is strong but complex and relies heavily on commercial operating routines. If those routines break in wartime, even more burden shifts onto trucks, and the fuel problem grows. 6. The economic suicide pill. The even if you win, you lose part. Now let's go to what most people skip. Say you somehow control some regions. Then what? The U.S. economy is so intertwined with the global system that knocking it offline doesn't just shake the U.S., it shakes the world. And some of that shockwave comes back and hits the invader. Let me explain a few concepts simply. The U.S. dollar has been widely used in global trade for a long time. When we say reserve currency, we mean this. Countries keep certain currencies in their central bank reserves because they're considered reliable, and the dollar is one of the main ones. Many commodities, like oil, some raw materials, and major trade flows are priced in dollars. Now, imagine when order collapses in a massive economy, financial markets panic, trade slows, insurance premiums rise, shipping is disrupted, banks become cautious. Companies cut investment. That chain hits the invader too, because occupation is not cheap. You burn money every day, and it's money with an uncertain return. And in the modern world, tech infrastructure matters too. Cloud services, data centers, financial systems, software. These systems are globally interconnected. A major collapse in one place sends waves elsewhere. So, I crashed the U.S., I won, is often not realistic because in the global economy, everyone is on the same ship. And here's the dark joke. The invader can destroy the value of what they want to control. In a modern economy, value isn't just land. It's people, knowledge, corporate networks, trust, contracts, legal order, and financial flow. Without order, the land you hold isn't a productive machine. It's a giant, expensive problem. 7. The administrative nightmare, meaning federal structure and local governance. Final act. The U.S. is not a country run by a single center. It has a federal system. Simply put, there are 50 states, and each has its own government, institutions, and rules. There's a federal government above them, but everyday life often runs at the state and local level. And there are thousands of local administrations, counties, cities, agencies. What does that mean? It means planting a flag on a building in the Capitol doesn't mean the country surrenders. Governing isn't one button, it's thousands of buttons. For an occupier, there's no make one deal and it's done. Every place has its own order, law, habits, bureaucracy, identity. And occupation isn't just military. It's like doing civil service under fire. You have to distribute water, keep electricity running, collect trash, run hospitals, repair roads, operate courts. Where do salaries come from? Who trusts whom? In a structure this complex, the governing part is often more expensive than the fighting. And U.S. culture argues even with its own authorities. People protest, resist, sue, and complain. Now, imagine that under foreign occupation, passive resistance, strikes, boycotts, information hiding, slowing things down, non-compliance. Tanks don't solve that because a tank can crush a road, not make a system function. That's why the most dangerous thing for an occupier isn't enemy tanks. It's small disruptions that reappear every day. One day, fuel is late. The next day, communications fail. The next day, the repair crew doesn't come. Each looks small, but together they are disaster. So even in this scenario, the idea of conquering the U.S. often stays a fantasy because occupation is not just entering. It's staying and building a working order every day, and that order bleeds constantly. Logistics because of geography, security because of society, money because of the economy, and control because of the federal structure. Now let's sum it up. The oceans create a long supply line, and long supply lines break. Canada and Mexico are not easy doors, but separate geography and infrastructure problems. Major mountain belts force movement into choke points, and choke points slow the invader. Civilian gun density and the presence of experienced veterans can turn every region into a small resistance island. The continent's interior distances pull the invader into a logistical black hole. Global economic ties expand the risk of win and still go broke. And the federal and local governance structure destroys the take the capital and it's over idea. In this narrative, the U.S. isn't just a country, it's a huge system. And for anyone trying to seize it by force, that system behaves like a crime scene. Every step leaves traces. Every step amplifies mistakes. Every step multiplies costs. If you want me to unpack these headings with even clearer examples in the next part, write it in the comments. And I'm curious, which region, which type of geography, which lifestyle would grind an invader down the fastest? Mountains, big cities, or wide, empty-looking rural land? Don't forget to hit like, because the invisible monster called the algorithm either buries this video or lifts it up. And in the next episode, I want to show the sharpest teeth of this logistical meat grinder even more clearly.